The Starside Prophecy by Tirri. Read by the author. Chapter 46. The Finch. I don't know why I was surprised when my mum called to tell me she was divorcing Roy. The still small voice had already informed me of the probability. She also said she wanted to be closer to her children. I was sceptical of her sincerity in this assertion, but I kept that to myself because I was glad she would be moving nearer. She told me that her life with Roy was now just a grind. Roy didn't work because it was beneath him, and all the money that he had brought into the relationship 10 years previously had gone. My mother worked because she didn't want the power turned off, but she hated the mediocrity of her life. Her major complaint was that when she returned home at the end of the day, Roy was always sitting in his armchair puffing his cigar, listening to classical music, not having lifted a finger to help around the house. There was no money now to pay for help. Roy was devastated when my mum demanded a divorce, but my mother was indifferent. She had told me she had enough money stashed to put a deposit down on a small flat, and she'd found one in Hove she wanted to buy, which bordered Brighton. Roy was left to fend for himself and ended up moving into a rental bungalow in the small seaside town of Bognor Regis further along the coast. I felt sorry for Roy, and as unlikely as I often thought the notion, I realised I wanted to keep in touch. I visited the poor deserted bastard alone in his little bungalow every couple of months or so. Roy liked to talk to the birds he was trying to tame. I got the feeling that because he was so used to people stepping around him with caution, there was no other pleasure in his life than gaining trust. One day a finch landed on his fingertips to retrieve the seed in his palm, which made him very happy, and I was happy for him. Roy never married again, and I was glad about that because being his wife carried serious penalties. During one of my visits, Roy admitted to me that he had beaten up his neighbour's eldest son. Roy always had a thing about noise, and apparently his idiot neighbour's child liked to drive his car late at night with the bass on the stereo cranked up. Roy told me he had gone to the neighbour's house to complain politely, but when the eldest son said, "Mind your own fucking business, old man," Roy got angry. I asked him whether he was in trouble with the police. He was circumspect about his answer, eventually admitting that he had been put on probation for assault and asking me not to mention this to anyone. Roy was 70 years old, and the judge must have been lenient because he was technically an old-age pensioner. Perhaps the judge was in awe that Roy had kicked the shit out of a guy decades younger. As a young man, Roy had been a cadet at the Royal Military Academy at Sandhurst, but he was court-martialed and subsequently discharged for punching an officer. He always bragged about the fact that he had been trained to kill with his bare hands, and a diploma attesting to this was once again displayed, as it had been in his study years before, this timing in the dining area of his little bungalow. I would sometimes keep my mum abreast with what was going on in Roy's life, and she would mostly say the same thing. "Why bother, Sarah? He's horrible." "Well, you sacrificed me to pacify him, and I knew he was horrible back then," I once said in response. My mother darted me a look containing trace emotions of guilt and remorse, filtered through semi-concealed irritation that always characterised her responses to any exchange she wished wasn't happening. But my mum had a sense of fair play, always had done, which meant she could be remarkably reasonable, and she knew I was right on this account and so let it drop. Roy sometimes liked to cook for me. I would bring the wine. He knew I loved potatoes, and he handed me a pile of them smothered in melted butter and weighing what always felt like 3 pounds, and I was moved when he did this because he was trying to please me. He didn't like the fact that I was so skinny, and was fatherly when addressing this concern. Being a stewardess was physically demanding, especially if one wore high heels all flight. One girl told me she had worn a pedometer on a flight from London to Chicago, and she had walked 8 miles, and so my thinness was merely a byproduct of the work. I tried to explain that to Roy. Roy sometimes asked about my trips, and I told him that I had visited many of the world's glitzy neon-lit metropolises, but these were forgettable by comparison because it was a third world toilets that jarred me more than anything I had ever seen in my 23 years on planet Earth. It was often on the ride from the airport to the hotel and from behind my Paloma Picasso sunglasses that I came face to face with the day-to-day conditions that other people had to deal with. I thought much of planet Earth was a big, disgusting shithole and was spellbound by the physical and psychological squalor of what I was seeing. The squalor ranged from bad to very bad, from disgusting to very disgusting, and to so fucking disgusting that words could not describe conditions. It is funny how comparisons can make one feel so much better about one's own life. But sometimes the guilt I felt about my life being so pampered was nearly overwhelming, and I would look up at God and say, "How could you?" I witnessed a gang of 8-year-old children fighting for dirty food scraps on the streets of Rio de Janeiro. Where were their parents, I often wondered? High, in jail, dead? Or worse, perhaps they didn't have what it took to care anymore. As I journeyed towards the Ming tombs in China, I passed peasants slaving in the paddies for $10 a day. I watched elderly Chinese women hobble along because someone had decided to bind their feet when they were babies. I retched at the stench of unrefrigerated meat at the market in Nairobi and quickly shied away from the gaunt souls trying to sell it. On the way to and from the airport, I watched as their wives and daughters carried huge pots of water on their heads. I saw homeless Pakistani children shiver in shop doorways because no one gave a damn whether they were cold. I saw pubescent girls dance topless on the laps of leering white males, old enough to be their fathers, in Bangkok's seediest bars. I told Roy about these stories, but it was as if he felt sorrier for me having to witness his travesties from a distance than for the actual suffering of the people he didn't know. Again, I would look up to the heavens and say to God, "How could you?"